Some men carry their shame the way they carry everything else, quietly and alone, in a place nobody is supposed to look. Not because they're dishonest, not because they don't love the people around them, but because the men who taught them how to be men never showed them another way. You take a problem into yourself, you work it until it breaks, or until you do, and you never let it scatter onto the people who need you to hold together. For Warren Coles, third-generation wheat and corn farmer, Custer County, Nebraska, that meant 6 years of silence. 6 years of a number he carried around in his chest like a stone he'd swallowed and couldn't pass and wouldn't mention. 6 years of watching his son work beside him in the field and never once saying, "There's something I need to tell you about the farm." He didn't lie to Caleb. He just didn't tell him the whole truth. He said the farm was almost clear. He said the debt was nearly gone. He said, "Asterisk, don't worry about the farm, Caleb. It's going to be fine, asterisk." And then he died on a January morning with the stone still inside him. 3 days after the funeral, Caleb drove to the Custer County assessor's office in Broken Bow, Nebraska, to begin the title transfer. He had the death certificate. He had the will. He was expecting paperwork. What he got instead was a screen printout with a lien holder notation, an active bank lien filed in October 2019, and a phone call that afternoon from a loan officer named Daniel Schreiber, who said the words, "Note review in 60 days and remaining balance of $81,400. That number didn't match anything his father had ever said. If you've ever found out something about someone you loved after they were gone, after it was too late to ask why, you know what this story is about before it starts. Because sometimes the hardest thing a son has to do isn't grieve his father. It's figure out what to do with the truth his father never gave him. This is the story of 380 acres, a handwritten ledger, a gray metal cash box under a workbench, and what Warren Coles was 9 months away from when his heart gave out. Custer County sits in the center of Nebraska, not the flat, featureless center people imagine when they think of the Great Plains, but the rougher, sandier soiled country where the sandhills push up toward the cropland and the horizon feels closer than it actually is. It is a county of winter wheat and corn rotations, of livestock on the edges of the tillable ground, of families who have been in the same sections for 3 and 4 generations, and who measure stability not in anything you can hold, but in the absence of catastrophe. The Coles family had farmed the same 380 acres since 1944, when Warren's grandfather, Eldon, bought the original 240-acre parcel from an estate sale after the war. Eldon expanded it in the 1950s. Warren's father added the north 80 acres in 1967. Warren himself, when he inherited at 31, inherited the whole piece intact, along with the understanding, never spoken directly, but absorbed like humidity, that the land was not an investment. It was a responsibility. You did not sell it. You did not borrow against it carelessly. You kept it, and you worked it, and eventually you handed it to someone who would do the same. Warren was the kind of man who arrived. That's the only word for it. He didn't announce himself, didn't occupy more space than he needed, didn't fill a room with noise or opinion or sentiment. But when Warren showed up to work, for a neighbor, for a church event, for a county co-op meeting, the thing that needed doing got done. His word was his contract. He'd never had a lawsuit in his life. He'd never bounced a check that he didn't cover within the same week and never speak of again. He married Donna Harbach from Arnold in 1982. She was a bookkeeper by training and a realist by nature, and she loved Warren in the particular way that practical women love complicated men. She understood what he was without requiring him to explain it. She kept the household accounts. She did the taxes. She held the family budget with both hands and kept it from tipping. But she had never challenged Warren about farm finances, because in 37 years of marriage he had never given her a reason to. And because in their generation, on their land, that was still largely his domain to manage. Donna got sick in late 2022. Ovarian cancer, diagnosed in October, moved fast. She died in the spring of 2024. Caleb had been living and working the farm since 2017, when he'd come back from Lincoln to help during her first round of treatment. He never entirely left after that. He found himself folded back into the rhythms of the place, into the 4:30 mornings, the smell of fuel and soil and turning season, the particular silence of a field where you can hear a distant combine a mile away like a heartbeat. What Caleb and Warren had together was not a close relationship in the way that word is usually meant. They didn't talk much. They didn't have long conversations about the family or the future or the past. What they had was proximity, the kind of quiet, daily proximity that on a working farm sometimes means more than conversation. They moved together like two people who'd learned the same language without ever sitting down to study it. Warren knew what Caleb was going to do before he did it. Caleb could tell his father's mood by the pace of his boots on the shop floor. But there were rooms in Warren that Caleb had never been let into. Finance was one of them. Warren maintained his own ledger, a green-ruled composition notebook in a gray metal cash box under the workbench in the shop. He kept it separate from the formal farm records that went to the accountant every April. Nobody looked at it. Nobody was supposed to. The farm itself ran on a 1994 John Deere 4960 that Warren refused to replace despite its 300,000 hours and a hydraulic system that behaved predictably on its own terms rather than the operator's. That machine has 20 years left in it. Warren said every time the subject came up, and every year it kept running, which Warren took as confirmation rather than luck. There was something in his refusal to replace it that was, in its own way, diagnostic, a man who believed that things which were already paid for should be used until they gave out, and that acquiring something new when the old thing still worked was a form of weakness. It was a belief that shaped his relationships with his finances, his equipment, his silences, and ultimately his son. In the spring of 2019, the planting window in Custer County stayed closed for 11 days past the first calendar target. It rained in a way that didn't feel generous. Gray, persistent rain that pooled in the low fields and delayed emergence and moved the whole year's schedule back in a way that could not fully be recovered. Caleb and Warren planted what they could when the ground opened, but the corn in the north sections went in late and came in short. A yield shortfall of roughly 14% against the prior year and against the input costs that had already been committed. The wheat did better, but the wheat alone didn't carry the year. The operating note at First National and Broken Bow had run steady since the early 2000s. It was a standard agricultural operating line, renewed annually each April, structured to cover seed, fuel, fertilizer, chemical programs, and other production inputs, repaid from crop receipts after harvest. Most years it cleared. Some years it carried a balance into the next season, which the bank had always been willing to roll forward on a farm with this track record. In September 2019, the Case IH 2388 combine, bought used in 2007 for $68,000 and maintained carefully in the shop, through a rotor issue that required immediate repair. The parts and labor cost $22,400. Warren had it quoted from 2 shops in the county before committing. He looked at the option of leasing newer equipment instead. He looked at it seriously for about a week. Then he paid for the repair because a lease meant another monthly payment, and a monthly payment meant a commitment he couldn't control, and Warren didn't make commitments he couldn't control. By October, the numbers for the year were clear, and they did not clear the operating note. The crop revenue, minus inputs, minus the combine repair, minus the household draw, left a shortfall on the note of approximately $53,000 against a balance that was already $94,000 before the year began. Warren drove to First National on a Tuesday morning in October. He went alone. He sat across from a loan officer named Dennis Pauley, who had been Warren's contact at the bank for 11 years, and he laid out the shortfall. Pauley told him his options. He could renew the operating line as normal and carry the balance, with higher interest exposure going forward. He could apply for a restructured term note, essentially converting the operating line into a longer-term loan against the farmland collateral, which would lower monthly exposure but add years to the debt obligation. Or he could sell assets to reduce principal, which Dennis said carefully and briefly because he'd been working in farm lending long enough to know which men you say that option to and which ones you don't. Warren signed the restructured note. 7-year term, 6.4% interest, new principal of $147,000, which folded in the operating shortfall, the combined repair, and the remaining operating balance. Monthly payment of $2,287. The farm's 380 acres served as collateral. He was back home by 4 o'clock. He didn't say what had happened. Caleb asked if things were okay. Warren said, "Asterisk tough year. We'll make it up. Asterisk." He said it the way he said most things, flat, sure, done. End of conversation. Caleb didn't press. He never pressed his father. That was how they worked. The ledger Warren kept never lied. He recorded every transaction with the precision of a man who understood that numbers were a form of honesty even when the conversation that should accompany them never happened. The entry for October 14th, 2019 read, asterisk extension signed, $147,000, 84 months, 6.4, shame on me, asterisk. 3 words. Shame on me. Written at the end of a single accounting line, the way a man might close a prayer he wasn't sure anyone was listening to. Not self-pity. Something harder and more private than that. An acknowledgement. A verdict he'd passed on himself and filed away. What happened next, in Warren's ledger, was 4 years of quiet, careful effort. He made every scheduled payment. In the months where cash flow allowed it, he added extra. $400 here, $600 there, occasionally $1,200 when a crop came in clean and the elevator price cooperated. He tracked every additional dollar in pencil in the right margin, with a small star beside each one. By 2023, there were 4 stars on the annual summary page. By 2024, there were 6. He didn't tell Donna about the extension. Not clearly. He told her they'd work something out at the bank after the hard year, that things would be tighter for a while. She adjusted the household draw without asking for the specifics, the way she'd adjusted to a dozen things over the years. She trusted Warren, and Warren knew she trusted him, and he carried that trust like a second weight alongside the first. He didn't tell Caleb, because Caleb was 35 years old and just reestablishing himself on the farm after years half in and half out, and Warren did not want his son to believe the place was failing. He wasn't lying about the trajectory. He believed, genuinely and with evidence, that he would have it paid off before Caleb ever needed to know. He kept a separate line in the ledger where he tracked what the balance would be at the current payment pace. He updated it quarterly. He watched the number fall. There is a logic in this that belongs to a specific generation of farm men who absorbed the post-depression ethic through their fathers and grandfathers, who grew up in households where debt was a source of shame deep enough to alter a man's posture, his sleep, his willingness to look his neighbors in the eye at Sunday service. You did not spread your financial difficulty to your children. You did not borrow against your integrity with the people who depended on you. You carried it and you worked it off, and someday, when it was gone, you didn't even have to mention it because the evidence would be the absence of the problem. A clean deed was its own explanation. Warren believed he had time. In 2020, he made an extra $4,100 in overpayments. In 2021, the year ran close and he held to the schedule. In 2022, a summer dry spell cut the corn average again, and he made minimum payments for 6 months before September caught him up. In 2023, the farm had a strong year, the best corn yield since 2017, and Warren began making $600 in monthly overpayments on top of the scheduled note. He added a second tracking column to the ledger for accelerated payoff projection. By December of 2024, the note balance had fallen to $89,000. At his current pace, Warren calculated in pencil on the December page, the farm would be clear by October 2026. He was 68 years old, and his heart was tired in a way he chose to interpret as aging. He'd been having chest pains since March of 2025, sharp, brief, occurring during heavy work, gone by the time he sat down. He told no one. He finished the spring planting on schedule. He finished the summer field maintenance. He began harvest in a condition the doctor would later describe, with clinical restraint, as functioning significantly below adequate cardiac output. In November 2025, after 7 months of dismissal, Caleb found him sitting on the shop steps after moving a grain cart and asked, plainly, whether his father was all right. Warren said he was tired. Caleb drove him to the clinic in Broken Bow the following morning. The cardiologist in Grand Island told him he'd had a minor infarction sometime in the previous spring, silent, undetected, worked through, and that his heart had been compensating on reduced function for months. He needed a procedure. He was given a list of things to avoid. He was given a follow-up appointment in January. He didn't make it to January. He died in bed on the morning of January 8th, 2026. It was a Wednesday. Caleb found him at 5:47 a.m., when the house was still dark and the winter field was frozen and the gray truck was exactly where it always was, keys in the ignition, farm still whole. The balance on the First National note that morning was $81,400. Warren had been 11 months from clearing it. The weeks after a parent's death on a working farm have a particular quality that no one warns you about. The grief is real and it arrives completely, but the farm doesn't pause for it. Equipment needs to run. Checks need to be in the right places. Annual certifications have early February deadlines. The soil doesn't stop its chemistry because the man who understood it is gone. Caleb went through the arrangements the way he went through most things, methodically, without complaint, grateful for the people who brought food and showed up, and then went home when the work was done. Leanne came from Omaha. She was back in her car Sunday afternoon. She and Caleb had the relationship of siblings who shared parents and a childhood, but not much daily life after 20. They were not at odds. They were simply distant in the way that happens when one person stays on the land and one person doesn't. 9 days after the funeral, Caleb went to clean out the workshop. It needed doing. There were tools that would rust if left unorganized through another Nebraska winter, belts that needed hanging properly, a half-finished project on the work table that had to be either completed or cleared. And Caleb needed to be in the shop, needed to be somewhere that smelled like his father without being the bedroom where his father had died. The shop was Warren's room, not the house. The shop. He swept the floor. He didn't reorganize the tools. Warren's system for the tool wall made a kind of internal sense that Caleb could read, but couldn't have reproduced. It was organized by the logic of a man's hands and the order in which problems were usually encountered, not by size or label. Caleb left it the way it was. Under the workbench, behind a can of WD-40 and an old coffee tin of fence staples, he found the gray metal cash box. The same kind sold at every hardware store in the county for $22. He'd seen it before. He'd assumed receipts, maybe old insurance paperwork. He rattled it. It wasn't empty. It wasn't locked. He opened it. Inside, a First National Deposit envelope, a rubber band around 3 bank statements, and a green-ruled composition notebook. The standard farm ledger book, the kind his father had kept in the same format since Caleb could remember. He opened the cover. The first entry was January 2016. He closed it. He didn't read it that evening. He carried it to the kitchen and set it on the table. And then he went out to check the soil sensors in the north section, because it was the kind of thing you check in January when a run of warm days softens the surface and you want to track what's underneath. The work is always there, and sometimes the work is the only answer to a feeling you're not ready to name. The ledger sat on the table when he got back. It sat there overnight. It sat there through 2 more working days. That is its own kind of faith, not the faith of prayer or scripture or a verse written in the margin, but the faith of a man who can leave something on the table and trust himself to open it when he's ready, and trust that whatever is inside it is something he can carry. Some people call that patience. Some people call it avoidance. On a working farm, in the middle of January, in a cold kitchen with a dead father's boot print still in the mud by the door, it felt like something closer to grace. He opened it on a Sunday afternoon, 3 days before he drove to the county assessor's office. He sat at the kitchen table with the afternoon light crossing the floor and read every entry from January 2016 to December 29, 2025. January 22, 2026. Broken Bow, Nebraska, 8:53 in the morning. The Custer County Assessor's office occupies a corner of the county courthouse building on the main street in town, a functional government space, fluorescent lit, with 2 clerks' windows and a row of 4 chairs along one wall. Caleb had been there once before, years earlier, for a property boundary question. He walked in with a manila folder and the quiet certainty of a man who believes he understands the shape of his problem. The clerk ran the property record for the 380-acre parcel, Section 12, Township 14. She was polite and efficient. Within 2 minutes, the lien holder notation appeared on her screen. First National Bank of Broken Bow, filed October 2019, active. She printed the summary and slid it across the counter the way county clerks pass documents, matter-of-factly, without commentary, because the information belongs to the requester and it is not her role to interpret it. Caleb said thank you. He folded the paper and put it in his coat pocket without looking at it again. He drove to the Farm Bureau office on the north end of town to handle a different piece of estate paperwork. He sat through a conversation about policy transfer that took 40 minutes. He drove home. At 2:14 that afternoon, his phone rang. First National, a local number. The caller identified himself as Daniel Schreiber, agricultural loan officer. He said he was sorry for Caleb's loss. He'd known Warren as a customer since 2021, Dennis Pauley having retired that year. He said he was calling because their records showed a change in borrower status and that standard procedure following the death of the primary borrower on an active note required a formal account review within 60 days. He said the note was in good standing. Warren had made every scheduled payment without exception for 6 years. The most recent payment had been deposited December 29th. The note was performing and had been performing continuously since origination. None of that changed the procedure. The review, Schreiber explained, would result in one of 3 outcomes. The note transfers to the estate inheritor under existing terms. The note is refinanced under new terms appropriate to the new primary borrower. Or, if the estate is unable to service the debt, the note goes to collections and the collateral, the 380-acre parcel, becomes subject to foreclosure review. Remaining balance as of the call, $81,400. 60 days, March 23rd. That evening, Caleb called Leanne. He laid out what he knew: the note, the amount, the 60-day window, the collateral. He tried to explain it clearly, the way you explain something to someone who hasn't been in the room for the context, patiently, without blame. Leanne listened. Then she said, "What's the farm worth at current value?" Caleb said approximately $720,000 in farmland at current Custer County per acre rates, though farmland values move, and that was a rough estimate. Leanne said, "So my half is around $360,000. There was a pause. Caleb said that was the gross figure before the note, before estate costs, before anything was sold. He said that $360,000 didn't exist as cash. It only existed as dirt. If she wanted liquidated value, somebody had to sell dirt. Leanne said she understood that, but she also said she had a mortgage of her own, 3 kids and school costs, and she couldn't carry an abstract inheritance for an indefinite period while Caleb worked out a plan. "I need my share, Caleb. I'm not trying to take anything from you, but I have a life out here too." She wasn't wrong. She had a legal right. The estate was real, so was her interest in it. What she was asking, a buyout of her 50% equity share, required Caleb to either find $360,000 in cash he didn't have, or sell land he wanted to keep, or find a financing structure that could cover both the outstanding bank note and his sister's buyout without destroying the farm's ability to operate. He said, "Give me a few weeks." She said, "I'm not trying to make this hard." He said he knew. He sat with the phone in his hand after hanging up and looked at the ledger, still on the kitchen table where he'd left it from Sunday afternoon, still open to the October 2019 entry. He read those 3 words again, the ones his father had written at the end of the line where the extension was recorded. Shame on me. He understood now why the box had been under the workbench. Caleb spent 3 evenings that week working through the math. He didn't do it emotionally. He'd inherited enough of his father's restraint to separate feeling from calculation when the calculation mattered. He sat at the kitchen table with a legal pad and the ledger and his laptop and the bank statement summaries, and he mapped out what existed. Assets: 380-acre parcel, approximately $720,000 fair market value. 1994 John Deere 4960. Fair market $18,000. Shop equipment, grain handling, small machinery, roughly $30,000 additional. Total, approximately $768,000. Liabilities: First National Operating Note, $81,400 remaining. Funeral and estate settlement costs, approximately $14,000. Legal fees for title work, estimated $3,000 to $5,000. Total, approximately $98,400. Net estate, approximately $670,000. Leanne's 50% interest, $335,000, whether she wanted it in cash or kind. Caleb's options were clear, even if none of them were good. He could sell the entire farm, split the proceeds, and walk away from 3 generations of Cole's land with roughly $165,000 after settling debts. He could fight Leanne's share in court, but she was legally entitled to it, and he would spend money he didn't have to lose a case he was going to lose. He could refinance the note and attempt to buy Leanne out with additional debt, though that would require the bank to loan him approximately $416,000 against a farm already carrying collateral obligations, which no banker in Custer County was going to approve on an operating farm with 1 person. Or he could sell the south 80 acres. He'd thought about it since the day he looked at the plat. The south parcel, 80 acres along the fence line that met Harold Tewes' ground was the farm's least productive section. Heavier clay content, a low spot in the southwest corner that held water in wet springs, a drainage tile that Warren had improved twice but never fully solved. The South 80 averaged roughly $1,900 per acre adjusted yield value. The rest of the farm averaged closer to $2,300. It was the logical piece to sell. Warren had considered it in 2015. Caleb remembered the conversation. He'd had an offer from Harold Tewes' father. He turned it down. When Caleb asked him why, Warren had said only, "Your grandfather broke that ground," which was not an answer exactly, but it was all the answer Warren had. Caleb thought about that for a long time. Then he picked up the phone. He called Daniel Schreiber at First National on a Monday morning and asked for an 80-day extension on the review period. Not a waiver, not a special treatment, just enough time to resolve the estate in an orderly way without forced sale pressure. Schreiber said standard procedure was 60 days. Caleb said, "I understand that. I'm asking for the time to do this correctly so it doesn't cost the bank anything and it doesn't cost me the farm. I think that's in both of our interests." Schreiber said he'd take it to his manager. He called a land broker in Broken Bow about the South 80. The broker put the likely price between $180,000 and $190,000 at current market, assuming neighbor interest. He said neighbor sales moved faster and cleaner than open market. Caleb called Harold Tewes. Harold was his father's counterpart in most ways, a man of equivalent generation and similar silence, who'd farmed adjacent ground for 40 years and always maintained the shared fence line correctly. Harold said he'd been waiting 15 years for that question and he'd have a number by the end of the week. Then Caleb called Leanne. He told her he had a plan. He told her he wasn't going to fight her share, wasn't going to ask her to wait 2 years, wasn't going to make her carry an abstract inheritance. He said, "You're his daughter too. You deserve what he meant to give you. I'm going to find a way to give it to you." He heard her breath change on the phone. Then she said, "I didn't know how bad the finances were." He said, "Neither did I." Harold Tewes came back with $182,500 for the South 80. It was a fair price, not a fire sale number, not a charity number. Farmland in that section of Custer County had appreciated 12% over the prior 3 years, and Harold wanted the ground badly enough to come in at market without negotiation. The transaction closed on February 17th. Caleb signed in an attorney's office in Broken Bow. Harold Tewes shook his hand and said, "Your dad was a good neighbor. I'll farm it right." Caleb said he knew. From the $182,500, Caleb paid Leanne $91,000, her equity share in the south parcel net of her proportional share of the outstanding note. The estate attorney structured the agreement carefully. Leanne accepted it. She wasn't happy in the way that full contentment is happy. She'd expected more, and the math of farmland equity is always someone's disappointment, but she didn't contest it. They signed the agreement on a Wednesday morning in the same office, across the table from each other, and walked out to separate cars. The remaining $91,500 from the sale went toward the First National note. That reduced the outstanding balance to $32,400. On March 12th, Caleb drove back to First National and asked to meet with Daniel Schreiber. He brought a printed repayment proposal, regular monthly payments continuing at Warren's existing schedule, with an additional $1,200 monthly overpayment, against a remaining agricultural operating balance of $32,400 on a 300-acre collateral base. At that rate, the note would clear in 19 months. Schreiber reviewed it. 2 days later, A bank officer called to say they'd accept the terms. Caleb signed a revised agreement on March 14, 2026. He drove home in the gray truck. Warren's truck, the same vehicle his father had driven to that same bank on a Tuesday morning in October 2019 when he'd signed the extension and come home and not said anything at supper. The truck ran the same way it always had. The fields along the county road looked the same way they always had. The only thing that had changed was what Caleb knew about the man who'd driven this route before him. When he got home, he set the loan papers on the kitchen table next to the ledger. He sat down. He read the last entry one more time. December 29th, 2025, Warren's handwriting, the balance circled, and the sentence beneath it that he'd already read 20 times. Caleb should have this clear by spring 2026, if he keeps going. He had been planning to hand it over. That was the plan. Some morning in October or November 2026, when the balance hit zero, Warren was going to close the ledger and put it somewhere Caleb would eventually find it. Or maybe just tell him, at supper, the way Warren told things, quiet and final. Asterisk the note at First National is clear. You don't have to worry about it. Asterisk just like that. And that would be the entire conversation. He was 9 months away when he died. Caleb had cleared it in 60 days, but he'd cleared it by selling 80 acres. 80 acres his father had refused to sell 12 years earlier, had called sacred in the way farm men call things sacred without using that word, had protected at the cost of carrying a $147,000 note through drought years and bad harvests and a heart condition he never disclosed. The math was clean. The cost of the math was something else. Caleb thought about his grandfather breaking that south ground in 1952. He thought about Warren turning down Harold Tews's father in 2015, standing in this kitchen, saying simply, "Your grandfather broke that ground." He thought about how much of the farm's 60-year history had existed. For Warren, not as balance sheet entries, but as moral commitments to people who were dead, to the soil they'd turned, to a standard of stewardship that left no room for letting go of what had been earned. He understood his father in that moment, in the way that understanding sometimes arrives too late to do anything with. Not better than before. Not more completely, just differently. In a way that made the silence less mysterious and the shame less damning. Warren had not been afraid. He'd been trying to protect everyone from his own failure. That is a different thing. It doesn't make it right. The silence had its costs, but it makes it human. It is March in Custer County, Nebraska, which means the soil temperature is climbing through 38 degrees and heading toward the threshold where the ground will first accept a seed. The gray light of winter is giving way to something slightly less definitive. Not warm yet, not spring yet, but open in a way that January was not. Caleb has 300 acres now instead of 380. He has a note with 19 months left on it and a monthly obligation he can meet from a working farm, which is all a monthly obligation ever needs to be. He has the 1994 John Deere 4960, which in February he serviced completely. New fuel filters, new belts, hydraulic fluid purged and replaced, the troublesome steering cylinder rebuilt by a mechanic in Broken Bow who spent a full afternoon on it and charged him $340. The machine runs. It runs because Warren maintained it without complaint for 30 years, because he believed that things worth owning were worth keeping, and because on a farm with enough to worry about, mechanical failure is a form of recklessness you earn by neglect. The South 80 belongs to Harold Tews now. Harold will plant corn on it this spring. Caleb can see it from the cab of the 4960 when he runs the north section. Just past the fence line, the ground that was Cole's ground is now Tews' ground, and the difference is hard to describe except to say that it sits differently than distance does. Distance is the absence of a thing. Sale, is the presence of a choice. Caleb does not regret it. He made the best calculation available to him with the information he had and the constraints he was given. He kept the farm. He kept it whole and working and in his name, without debt compounding against it, without a court forcing a sale, without his sister waiting years for an inheritance she's legally owed. He made a hard choice quickly, and he stand behind it. What he carries instead is the understanding of what it cost his father not to make the same choice. Warren could have sold the South 80 in 2015. Harold Tooze's father would have paid fairly. The ground was worth buying then, as it is now. If Warren had sold it, he could have cleared the original operating note, reduced his operating exposure, freed himself from the cycle of tight years and extension risk, and arrived at 2019 without a structural vulnerability. He might have lived differently. He might have slept differently. He might have told Caleb something at supper that Caleb would have been glad to hear. But Warren Coles was a man for whom selling land was not a financial decision. It was a verdict. It meant something had gone wrong that couldn't be fixed any other way, and Warren was not willing to return that verdict on himself as long as there was another option, even if the other option was 6 more years of silent debt. Even if the other option was running his heart down to a fraction of its capacity rather than saying, "I need to let go of 80 acres." That was the man. That was always the man. Caleb drives the fence line on a Tuesday evening at the end of March. He runs the whole perimeter, all of what is now 300 acres, in the slow, quiet way that farmers drive fence line when they're not looking for breaks but for something else. He goes north, then east, then south to the corner where the old boundary post stands, the one his grandfather Eldon set in 1948. Cedar post, still in the ground, a stripe of faded orange paint at eye level from the surveying. A little lean to it, but holding. He sits there with the truck engine idling until the light goes amber and then gray. He does not pray out loud. He has never been a man who prays the way the radio preachers on the AM band describe prayer, with words, with requests, with a specific addressee and an expected response. What Caleb has is quieter than that. It's the willingness to sit in a cold truck at the edge of his grandfather's post until whatever needs to settle in him settles. He thinks about the entry in the ledger. Shame on me. 2 words, 3 words. A man's entire verdict of himself, written in pencil in a notebook in a cash box under a workbench where no one would find it until he was gone. He thinks about what it would have meant for Warren to say it out loud instead. Not to the county, not to the bank, not even to Leanne, just to Caleb at the kitchen table over coffee in this same gray quiet. Asterisk, we had a hard year. I signed an extension. I should have told you. Asterisk, just that. What would have changed? He doesn't know. Maybe nothing. Maybe a great deal. The farm would still have needed working. The relationship would still have been what it was, quiet, useful, full of things both of them understood without saying. But Caleb would have been in the room. He would have been given the chance to say, asterisk, I know. We'll figure it out, asterisk. He starts the truck and drives back. The ledger is still on the kitchen table. He hasn't moved it. It will be there in the morning. He'll plant in a few weeks when the soil is ready, in the fields his grandfather broke and his father kept, on 300 acres that are clear in his and already warming towards spring. He'll keep going. That's what the entry said. If he keeps going. 380 acres became 300. A hidden note became an understood one. A man who never told his son the full truth left behind, under a workbench in a gray metal cash box, a 6-year record of trying to fix it alone. Warren Coles was not a dishonest man. He was a man shaped by a specific and powerful logic, that a father's job is to protect, that protection means carrying the weight yourself, and that handing someone something clean is worth more than handing them something with story attached. He believed that with his whole life. He worked toward it for 6 years at $2,287 a month, and then whatever extra he could find. He was 9 months from where he was trying to go. The South 80 is planted this spring by a different family. The note is nearly clear. The farm is smaller, and it is his. The ledger is still on the table. There's a question this story keeps returning to, and I want to leave it with you. Not because there is an answer, but because it is the kind of question that tends to find you sooner or later on its own. Is silence that carries a burden on your behalf a form of love, or just a different kind of debt passed on after you're gone? If you've ever found something out about someone after they were gone, something they kept to protect you, or kept because they couldn't find the words, or kept because letting go of it would have meant saying something they weren't ready to say, I'd like to hear about it in the comments. You don't have to share all of it. Sometimes the right weight belongs in more than one set of hands. This is the bank and the barn. Some stories end in survival. Some end in loss. Some end the way this one did, smaller than it started, clearer than it was, and still standing. Subscribe if you want to walk more of these fields. We'll be here,